Greetings, everyone. I'm Mar. Once again, this is my opinion. As you can tell from the title, I'm reviewing the third and final of the classic Indiana Jones trilogy. It would be years before we get another one, but that's next video. It, of course, is also my favorite of the classic three films and of the series in general. It is Indiana Jones in the Last Crusade. And as a kid, this was always my favorite of the three. I mean, it didn't have the same amount of spectacle as the previous film, and it didn't have that same dark tone. But for some reason, I always gravitated towards this one more. Maybe it was because I liked his partner in Sean Connery better than I liked the romance in the first one, or even his little interactions with Short Round in the second one, because that was kind of balanced by Willie, Indy, and then also the whole search for the Holy Grail plot and the night at the end. Maybe I was taking too more. But as an adult, it still is my favorite one, as parts of this review will show. Tell my new VHS of it. Apparently, this VHS also has an interview with Lucas, Spielberg, and Ford on it. Maybe I'll pop it in one of these days and watch that. That'd be fun. Now, this movie came out in May 1989, so this is the first one released after I was born. Granted, I was not even 3 months at the time, but still, I was alive. It was produced for about $48 million, and it made over $400 million worldwide. A pretty good budget to gross ratio. That's about 10 times. So even by the kabuki-ish number crunching of Hollywood accounting, where you got to make double your budget to break even, that's still a pretty good gross right there. I don't know what it would be considered if you adjusted it for inflation, but the numbers would probably be astronomical if you did that. Now, as I've already kind of hinted at, this film is not as dark as its predecessor, and part of that, I'd say it's a double. One, Spielberg and Lucas were not in the same frame of mind when they were writing this film as they were when they were doing Temple of Doom. You know, the divorces were long since passed, and in the years between, they were starting to regret how dark they made that film. That quote I mentioned that Spielberg did was actually around the time this film came out. It just says 89, so I don't know if it was right before or right after. But I know he was unsatisfied with how dark it was, and he wanted to do a third just to appease Lucas, and here we go. We get the best of the three. And I know some people will say that Beatwise Last Crusade is essentially a remake of Raiders of the Lost Ark, just like some people also say that Force Awakens is a remake of New Hope. I will say I don't consider either film to be a remake of the other, but I will, in the traditional sense, but I will say that they are very, very close in how they are done beat-wise. I mean, like, since I brought up Force Awakens and New Hope have a lot of the same beats, but that one I chalk up to them following the hero's journey formula pretty closely, and the fact they're set in the same universe and everything makes it a little bit harder for it not to feel like a copy, but that doesn't bug me. Just like it doesn't bug me here, and I only noticed it because James Rolfe and his buddies pointed it out in their video comparing which sequel was better. With this one, though, I will say that I think Last Crusade, it perfects those beats a little bit more. Raiders is always going to be iconic because of those shots and introducing Indiana Jones and reinventing some of the old film styles for a new audience. And, of course, all the Academy Awards that won. I mean, all three films got nominations, but it's the one that swept it in comparison. So in that way, I could see that one be more iconic, but from a technical standpoint, everything is perfected here. In the beats, the prologue where we see Indy going after an artifact and it's not related to the main plot, Indy being approached by the government to go find someone that vanished. He goes to find the person, he ends up with a female partner for a bit. The Nazis are involved, they get the artifact, and their misuse of it causes them to die. Indy loses the artifact by the end. There's a lot more, but those are just some of the main beats it follows, but I feel it perfects it here. And since I'm talking about the beats, I probably should relay the plot in a nutshell. The opening prologue is we see Indy as a teenager going after the Cross of Coronado, which he does get, but he has to return it by order of the sheriff, which part of me wonders, how was the sheriff able to even talk him into doing that when it was an archaeological find? Did the guy already have a claim to that spot? It's just something the film never goes into. I hope the novelization, if there is one, does. It's still one thing that has me scratching my head. Like, oh well, I guess the sheriff saw the piece of paper about it. show that even as a kid, Indy really did believe stuff like this belonged in a museum. And because of this, he earns his fedora. So it's like, that's the reason he goes after it. It's a relic from his childhood. He does get that artifact back in the modern age, which the film takes place in 38, so 2 years after Raiders. And unlike the previous film, we actually do feel like there's progression. But then again, we've seen him over the course of 2 adventures by this point. And plus, we go chronologically, it goes Temple, Raiders, and then now. So obviously he's going to feel a bit different in this film than the last film, because this is the last film chronologically. He takes the cross to Marcus Brody. Then he's approached by these essentially hired goons, even though the scene where they pull a gun was cut out in editing, which is why it kind of feels a bit weird. Like, they approach him, all of a sudden he's in a house. Even without the gun thing, it kind of feels like, hired goons, hired goons. Well, he is introduced to a man named Donovan, who is exceedingly rich, based on how he's shown in this scene. He tells Indy that he has a colleague looking for the Holy Grail, and that it's his father, who is a professor of medieval history. Indy's like, alright. At first he doesn't seem like he's interested, because it's like fairy tales, which is like, that's probably just him trying to downplay it for the client, and not him not believing, because he's already seen 2 artifacts that are supposedly legend, or like, yeah, right, they don't have powers in the previous 2 films, so I'd say he's just downplaying it. And then the moment he finds out his father's the one who went missing, he's like, alright, I'll go find him. Even though, from what we see, it looks like they are estranged. And based on how we see them act in the prologue, you can understand why, because it seems that Dr. Jones Sr. was not the most attentive father, which is a plot point that comes out multiple times throughout the film. He goes to Venice, which is where his father was. He is introduced to Dr. Ilsa, who was helping his father, and she becomes Indy's love interest throughout the film. They do eventually find Indy's father and the rest of the clues to take them towards the Holy Grail, which is an aside, even though it's heavily connected with Christianity. The Holy Grail is more an artifact from Arthurian legend. Just always interesting how they connect it back to here, when in the Bible and other religious things there's no mention of a Grail, other than, very loosely, like the whole blood of Christ thing, which is like, I guess you could just go with it for the sake of an adventure film. Once they find Indy's father is when the Nazis come into it. We find out both Elsa and Donovan were working for them, or should I say working with them, as it'll come up when I bring up the characters. And now Indy and his father, we got Dr. Jones times 2, which is actually a little gag. Dr. Jones, yes, have to get to Holy Grail before the Nazis do, and they're joined by Marcus Brody, Salah, and a handful of other characters around them, where they got to go through the desert, they got to get past a tank, they got to save a book during a book-burning rally in Berlin where Indy runs into Adolf Hitler. Which even nowadays, that's still a pretty awkward scene to watch, because Indy's like, oh crap, gets his book signed by Hitler. So in universe, that book's probably going to be worth some money in the future. And of course, have to pass trials in order to get to the Grail. And the ending is probably the most fitting ending you could do for this series, and at the time I have a feeling they knew this was going to be the last one, because the characters literally ride off into the sunset. If they hadn't done the 4th one, that would have been the perfect ending to this series, but with how they did the 4th one, that ending is also pretty fitting. Now, the whole Dr. Jones Sr., Holy Grail, Night in a Cave plot was not the original idea for this 3rd film. Way back in 85, following Temple of Doom, they actually had another idea in mind, which they had Chris Columbus write the script for, which would have involved the Monkey King in Africa, involving Indy and him playing chess with real people, amongst a whole other things. The reason they decided not to go with that one is because it was quote-unquote too unrealistic, which, when you look at a lot of stuff that happened in these films, it's like, really? Unrealistic? That's your reason? Or one of them? Which is just one of the reasons I'm curious to read this script one of these days. I know someone probably has found it and uploaded it online to read somewhere. The other reason is because it had antiquated descriptions of native Africans, to put it diplomatically. They were treated like how you would probably see them in an older serial, where it's like, really? I don't know if that was intentional or unintentional, but it comes across weird. I mean, if you have a problem with how the native Africans are portrayed in the second Ace Ventura film, you'd probably have a problem with how they would have been portrayed in this film. And in that regard, I'm actually glad. Just think about it. We already had enough complaints about how Hindu and Indian culture was portrayed in Temple of Doom. Even though you guys know from my last review, my whole view on that is it's the corruption of Hindu culture, not actually a reflection of it. With this one, there would be no such excuse unless the plot involved the Monkey King essentially having humans in bondage and forcing them to mentally degrade to lower primates. That's the only way I could see them getting away with that, but they'd have to actually state that on film for people not to complain about it, and people probably still would complain. Then we got another draft, which was closer to the final film. There's some differences, like Elsa was actually a main villain and not just a side villain. Indy would actually have to fight the knight. There's a lot of other major differences, but it's closer in plot to this one. And the fun thing about that one is that at first Spielberg was against the whole Holy Grail thing. He's like, I think it's too esoteric, George. I don't think we should go with this. But George, being how he is, he worked his friend down and they got to it. And the thing that really was a selling point for George to get Spielberg to go with the Holy Grail was it being more about the relationship between the father and son, which is why I think this film is the best out of all of them, because it has a fun adventure tone and the score that John Williams composed, which is beautiful. But it's that thematic resonance. I mean, think about it. The first film, you got a little bit of thematic resonance there with the two former flames reconnecting, but other than that, it's a straightforward adventure film. The second one, it's that whole thing about spiritual connection, but it's not really deep. It is definitely more of an adventure film. And then this one, you got the whole father-son connection. And that goes from the opening scene to the ending scene. As we see throughout the whole film, the two Joneses are estranged. And the scene on the Zeppelin is where we really find out why. It was because Dr. Jones Sr. was not really the best father. He did not really set any ground rules, didn't really help him that much. And Dr. Jones Sr. kind of counters it like, I didn't want to do all that. That I taught you self-reliance. And of course, Indy puts it bluntly, you basically showed me that you cared more about people who've been dead for centuries than me. And you can kind of tell that even though he didn't want to be an overbearing father, Senior ended up being a bad father in that way because he neglected his son, and they've been estranged ever since. And the whole film is essentially them reconciling, working together to stop the Nazis from getting the Holy Grail. And part of that is Indy learning to forgive his father for their past mistakes, and also Henry realizing that his son is more important than his life's work. I mean, his life's work is to find the Grail, and it's coming to fruition throughout the course of this film, but by the end he realizes that Indy is his greatest accomplishment. Or to borrow a line from another film that John Rhys Davies is in, Indy is his ultimate treasure. And the way he punctuates this is in the end when they almost have the Grail, and it's either get the Grail and die, or possibly die or whatnot, he decides to just tell Indy to let it go, but he does it in a way that it's not so subtle, but you really do feel it. Throughout the course of most of the film, he calls Indy Jr., because we find out Indiana is not his actual name. I think that was kind of a given, like, who names their son Indiana? It's his nickname that he took from a dog, which is a little meta joke, because that's exactly where they took his name from. But his real name is Henry Jones Jr., Senior Jr. But in that scene, to really nail home the point that he really cares more for his son, he calls Indy Indiana, and then tells him to let it go. In that scene, you really do feel it. And you're like, these two are going to be close from now on, to a point. And of course, this is combated following Indy having to go get the Grail in order to save his father's life. And the final screenplay was written by Jeffrey Boehm, who, if that name sounds familiar, he did some work on the Lethal Weapon series. He's uncredited on the first one, credited on 2 and 3, and he also wrote the screenplay for The Dead Zone, one of my favorite Stephen King adaptations. And he also wrote the screenplay for a film that I saw in theaters, and I need to revisit one of these days, The Phantom, which that one does get a lot of criticism from certain people regarding how all the action scenes are too similar to Indiana Jones. And they always bring up Jeffrey's involvement to put that as a nail in the coffin when you're forgetting that film like Indiana Jones is kind of a tribute to the old B-movie serials. That one more so since it's a comic character from that era, so of course it's going to have that same type of flair. Of course, Jeffrey's no longer with us, sadly, but he has left a legacy. Oh, look at that. He wrote the final screenplay for the best of the Indy films, so yeah, that's worth something. I mentioned in passing before, this film did get some Oscar nominations. It got one more than the previous one. It was nominated for Best Original Score, which it annoys me that John Williams did not win for this one, because I feel out of his scores for the Indiana Jones films, this is his best one. Because not only do we got that great Indiana Jones main theme, but we also got two additional themes that I love. You got that one score for the Nazis, which is both villainy and militaristic. Like, you really would imagine soldiers marching in tune with it, and it really does fit the Nazis. And second, you got that Grail theme, which has many variations throughout the film, depending on what emotion the scene is going for. But that one is like, that feels medievally, it feels fantasy, and it definitely echoes the whole Crusade to find the Grail perfectly. And then the rest of the score in between, beautiful. It really annoys me that he didn't win for that one. It did win for Best Visual Effects, which that he chose poorly seen alone. You can see why it won, which they used the puppetry and work in that scene. It's like, then of course there's other scenes throughout the film where you can see why it won for Best Special Effects. Oh, a lot of the matte painting work all around it, beautiful. I mean, I miss that type of work. I mean, it's not as obvious as it was in the previous film because the budget's a bit higher, and you know they've had two other films to work out the technical details, but it still looks beautiful. And then, of course, Best Sound, which for a film like this, you definitely need sound to be done in a certain way, and definitely deserved the nomination there. Which, as an aside, straight-up action films, that seems to be one of the few awards they get nominated for, Best Sound. It's like, where's an action film from this era getting nominated for Best Original Score? Then, of course, there's my whole rant about why action leads never got nominated, even if it was warranted. Like, it still grinds my gears that Stallone wasn't nominated for at least the first Rambo film. Like I've said it before, and I'll say it again, that nothing is over speech alone. Acting-wise, Harrison Ford, still top of his game in this film. You definitely feel that he has changed from the previous two films when you go in chronological order. And as throughout the course of the film, he changes too, because he forgives his father. He does have a pretty good chemistry with Sean Connery, who plays Jones Sr. You definitely believe them as father and son who have been estranged for a while, but still know enough about each other to where they can work off each other. And of course, it goes without saying the little meta reason for casting Sean Connery as Dr. Jones Sr. It's always been said that James Bond is the father of Indiana Jones, so who better to play Indiana Jones' in-world father than the original James Bond? Even though he's only 12 years older, how he looks, it works enough to where you would believe that he is old enough to be Indy's father. The only thing about casting James Bond in this role, and this is up to both the writing and Sean Connery's performance, is that throughout most of the film, you can definitely tell that the character is not used to doing some of the stuff Indy is used to doing. Which, considering who's playing the role, you're like, okay, how are they going to get me to buy this? But to Sean Connery's credit, with how he plays the character, you believe that he's not used to doing stuff like trying to use a lighter to free himself and then like looking at it and be like, the floor's on fire. Or, that's a better example, the whole biplane scene, which as I mentioned before, is a holdover from the script from Temple of Doom, which I'm glad they held it over because that would have felt a little intrusive too early in the film, but here, perfect scene. Where it's like, 11 o'clock, what happens at 11 o'clock? And then we start shooting, he shoots the back of their tail, which that always just made me laugh. More so the way that Connery tells them, but with that you believe this is his first time firing a gun from the back of a plane. And then of course, you do believe that he has no choice but to kill the guy. It's just like the awkwardness he has throughout the course of the film, where you believe that even though he goes out in the field, he's not used to doing it during war like Indy is, or has been in the past couple years. It's believable, even though at first you're like, yeah, okay, this is weird. And then, of course, his transformation at the end, where he realizes what's really important. Connery does really nail that and sell it. And the little chemistry him and Harrison Ford having that part really makes the emotional climax of the film. Denholm Elliott and John Rhys Davies return as Marcus Brody and Salah, respectively. They're one of the connections to the first film. Some people are like, it's just a semi-remake, which goes without saying, but their inclusion in the film doesn't feel intrusive. Marcus Brody, obviously, because he works at the same place Indy does. They both went to go find his father. The only thing there is that in the first film, he's used sparingly, so Marcus comes off as more a genuine mentor, where you still have that vibe here, but you can definitely tell that Marcus is more of a desk scholar. Indy can be both, but he seems more comfortable out in the field. Jones Sr. seems to be mostly a desk scholar, but can go do field work. He's just not used to this level of it. Whereas Marcus, he seems to be lost when he's required to do field work. And so he becomes the butt of the joke throughout the whole film, constantly getting captured, having a gun pointed at him, not sure where to go, and they even bring up he got lost in his own museum, which is something you would think they'd mention in the first film, but it's kind of a little gag. Sala, he's also used a bit more for comic relief than he was in the first film, but it's unlike Marcus, where Marcus is the butt of the joke, it's more that Sala is making the jokes, or saying stuff that turn into jokes. Like, the biggest one is when their car gets destroyed by the Nazi tank, and he's like, that was my brother-in-law's car. And then, of course, he gets the camels when he told him no camels. I said no camels, that's 5 camels. Compensation for my brother-in-law's car. And then, of course, making fun of Indy when we find out where his name comes from. You were named after the dog. John Rhys Davies, you can tell he's having fun with Sala. I mean, he had fun with Sala in the first one, but he seems to be having a bit more fun here. I think it's part of the reason where most of my memories of this character come from this film, just because of how he plays it. And, of course, as I mentioned before, there's a little line connection between him and the senior Jones character, which, from what I read, apparently Sean Connery was offered that role in that Aladdin film first, and then John Rhys Davies got it. I'd say John Rhys is a little less distracting. The only other voice they could have gotten for that character would have been Brian Blessed. Gordon's alive? River Phoenix played the young Indiana Jones, and even though he has less than 20 minutes of screen time, give or take, he does an excellent job. The danger of when you have a character being shown when they're younger in a live-action film is that you might lose the audience because they might go, I don't believe this is supposed to be the younger version of him, or you get them wondering, what changed them? But from here, the moment you see River Phoenix as young Indy up close, you believe this is a younger version of Harrison Ford's character. Just the way that River carries himself, the look on his face, you're like, that's Indy. And part of the reason is that River did not base his performance off of how you see Indy in the previous films. He studied Harrison Ford and based his performance off of what he saw from Ford. And he did a beautiful job, and it's a shame we lost River too early, because I have a feeling like his brother, he would have gone on to be nominated, if not win Academy Awards, if this is any indication. Of course, he did other great films too. Stand By Me is another classic from this same era. Another one of my favorite Stephen King adaptations. And the little fun thing is that in this film they actually explain where Indy gets that scar on his chin, even though he didn't really need to. His first time using a whip, which the fun thing about that is they used 2 lions in that scene, and I guess both lions were timid. It's like, timid? You can kind of tell there's something weird about the lions in those scenes, but I originally chalked it up to them having to control the lions for safety, but it seems like they were timid. So it's like those lions were the equivalent of the baboons in the Fly remake, where I guess they thought they were going to be hard to work with, but they turned out to be easier to work with. Alison Doody and Julian Glover play our main villains, Elsa and Donovan. Fun thing about that is that that's another James Bond connection, because they were in one of the Roger Moore Bond films, the one from '85, if I remember right. Which I think, if memory serves, I think that might have been the last of the Roger Moore Bond films, so end of an era right there. Then, of course, they work along Sean Connery in this one. And Doody goes from playing a lower tier female in the Bond film to playing the love interest of both the literal and metaphorical James Bond's son in this film. And of course, as we find out throughout the plot, she also slept with the elder Jones. So she technically is a metaphysical Bond girl in the fact that she slept with a character played by the original James Bond. Which, of course, that becomes part of the humor and part of the thing involving their relationship that I didn't mention. Alison, she does a pretty good job, although there's a couple times where her German accent does slip. But you could say it's because of her screaming and all that. Now, her character does work with the Nazis, but she doesn't believe in the ideology. And I feel the scene that really highlights that for her character is the book burning scene, because you could see in the close-ups when she's watching it. She doesn't say a word. It's just the way she carries herself and the look in her eyes. You could tell that watching these books burn is paining her. and if she could stop it, she would. But anything for the Grail. Her whole motivation is to get the Holy Grail. It doesn't matter if she has to portray one Jones, two Jones. Her whole code of ethics to work with these genocidal maniacs. But it's all about getting the Grail. And in the end, she does get it, and of course, it costs her her life because she goes too far. Julian is Donovan. He's more the straight villain in this one, even though he does have his own motivations. He just wants his place in history, be able to use the Holy Grail for immortality, which of course cost him his life in the end too. But he doesn't believe in the ideology either. He's just using it for his own ends. And it seems that the Nazis he worked with do know that, and it doesn't seem like they care. Like, as long as they can get the Grail and work. They never really comment on how they feel about Hitler, but it just seems the way they're acting around him. But it could all be a ploy. Once Ilsa and Donovan get the Grail, they could end up betraying them and taking the Grail for the Führer. It's just one thing that's never really addressed. Just the way around it. And of course, since he does shoot the Elder Jones, he is more of a straight-up villain than Elsa is. But he's not fully evil. He's he's like a dark gray character because of the stuff he does. You know, he's the one that forces Indy to do all this. Of course, he would have been a little bit more of a dark gray character if they kept that thing in about his hired goons in. Especially since he has a lot of this. But how he is, he's like a dark gray, he's like a medium dark gray character. And it works for the main villain. Of course, the Nazis around him are more the direct antagonists for Indy, especially the Colonel, who does get a good comeuppance in the end in that famous tank scene, which, when people cite the follow-up Crystal Skull as being unbelievable because of the fridge scene, look at the tank scene. With how it's portrayed, tell me. Of course, I'll get to that when I get to Crystal Skull. Spielberg's direction. As I've mentioned a couple times already in this review, I feel that a lot of the stuff carry over from the previous two films was perfected here, and part of that would be Spielberg's direction. Unlike Temple, you definitely can feel his fingerprints here. That one, you feel it more with how he shoots certain scenes, but the tone is kind of a flip for what he normally does. I mean, unless you count Poltergeist, but that one is the whole thing. Did he actually direct it? Was Toby just a director in name only? There's that whole thing. It's like the whole thing I'm not even going to get into here. But that one, it has more of a light dark tone, whereas Temple Doom is a more straight dark tone. This one definitely has a tone more similar to the first film, but it has a little bit of a lighter element in place in certain parts, mainly due to Brody being there for comic relief, Sala having two Joneses for the price of one, and also the fact that it's almost a decade after he made the first one, and he's made a couple films since then. He's grown as a director, and fine-tuning everything from the first film, it just definitely feels more like a professional Spielberg dealing with it. Not to say he wasn't a professional with Raiders, but you definitely feel his growth from the first film to this one as a director. Doesn't excuse what he did with Night Sky still, but you definitely feel his direction growth. And it definitely feels like one of his own films. And of course, the whole dynamic of having the father-son thing, that definitely is very Spielberg-y, because the whole motif he always seems to use with broken homes, absentee fathers, always seems to be in his films. And this one, this is where I think it's touched on the best, because it's actually part of the main plot for the main characters, instead of just being a background thing like, he's in Mexico with Sally. In conclusion, Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade is a well-made film. It is excellent. It's one of my favorite films of my birth year, and it's one of my favorite films of the 80s in general. If I had to do a top 10 of that decade, I could definitely see this film being on it. Other films I love from that decade, I'd probably have to arrange and go, how do I do this? But that one, no question, would be on the list. If you had to show someone just one Indiana Jones film, and they haven't seen the series at all, to introduce them to this series and get them to watch the rest, this would be my choice. Has some of the best action in the series, has great character interactions. The villains, even though the background ones are essentially one note, they work for this type of film. The two front villains are in that little gray area, so that it kind of adds to the whole thematic element. The thematic element between Indy and his father, the father-son thing, standard Spielberg, but this is it at its peak, its best execution. All the elements come together, well-shot film, great score, to make it a ride worth taking once, and worth taking again and again, like the Indiana Jones ride at Disneyland.